When you think of Argentina, what comes to mind? Tango, soccer, maybe vast Patagonian landscapes, or bustling Buenos Aires cafes. It's often called the Europe of South America, a nation defined by its strong European heritage. But this image, so carefully crafted, hides a profound and often intentionally forgotten history. What if I told you that Argentina once had a large, vibrant, and influential black population? What if I told you that their apparent disappearance wasn't an accident, but the result of a deliberate national project? Today, we're going to uncover the story of the Black Argentines who were erased from their own country's history. To understand this story, we have to go back to the late colonial era. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, people of African descent made up a significant portion of Argentina's population. In some areas, like the city of Buenos Aires, they constituted nearly a third of all residents. These were not just enslaved laborers. They were an integral part of society. Afro-Argentines were skilled artisans, merchants, domestic workers, and musicians. They were bakers, carpenters, and silversmiths whose work built the city. Their cultural contributions were immense, shaping everything from music and dance to local cuisine. The rhythms of the candem, an Afro-Argentine drum-based music and dance, echoed through the streets, laying the groundwork for what would eventually evolve into the world-famous tango trick. When the fight for independence from Spain began in the early 19th century, Afro-Argentines were on the front lines. They enlisted in the revolutionary armies in huge numbers. Motivated by the promise of freedom and a better future in a new nation they were helping to create. In fact, some historical accounts suggest that soldiers of African descent made up a majority in some of the most crucial regiments of the independence armies. They fought and died for Argentina's freedom, from the Andes to the Pampas. Their sacrifice was fundamental to the birth of the nation. It seemed as though Afro-Argentines were poised to be founding pillars of the new republic. So, the big question is, where did they all go? The story of their disappearance is complex and tragic, involving a combination of factors. First, there was the devastating human cost of war. The very same wars that Afro-Argentines fought so bravely in the Wars of Independence, followed by decades of civil wars and conflicts with neighboring countries like Paraguay, took a disproportionate toll on their community. Afro-Argentine men were often placed in the most dangerous frontline positions, essentially used as cannon fodder. The casualty rates were astronomical. Entire generations of men were wiped out on the battlefield, which had a catastrophic demographic impact on the black population. Families were shattered, and the community's ability to grow and sustain itself was severely weakened. Then came disease, too, in the mid to late 19th century. Devastating epidemics like yellow fever and cholera swept through crowded cities like Buenos Aires. These diseases hit the poorest and most marginalized communities the hardest. At the time, Afro-Argentines were often forced to live in segregated, low-lying neighborhoods with poor sanitation and little access to medical care. When the yellow fever epidemic of 1871 struck Buenos Aires, these areas became death traps. While the wealthy, mostly white residents fled the city, the poor, including a large portion of the black population, were left behind to face the plague. The epidemic decimated their numbers, further accelerating the demographic decline that had begun with the wars. But war and disease alone don't explain the full picture. This process is known as Blanqueamiento, or whitening. It wasn't just a social trend. It was a state-sponsored ideology. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Argentina's political and intellectual leaders embraced a vision of their nation as a modern, progressive, and exclusively European country. They looked to Europe, not to their own diverse roots, for their national identity. This ideology was explicitly racist. Leaders like President Domingo Sarmiento famously wrote about the need to civilize the country, which to them meant replacing its indigenous and African heritage with European culture and people. To achieve this vision, the government launched one of the most ambitious immigration campaigns in modern history. They actively encouraged and subsidized mass immigration from Europe, primarily from Italy and Spain. Between 1870 and 1930, millions of European immigrants poured into Argentina, fundamentally reshaping its demographics. The official goal was to whiten the population. As these European immigrants arrived, the national narrative began to change. Whiteness became synonymous with progress, modernity, and national pride. Blackness and indigenousness, on the other hand, were framed as symbols of a barbaric past that needed to be overcome and forgotten. This ideology had a direct impact on how race was recorded and perceived. As Afro-Argentines intermarried with the new waves of European immigrants and other groups, their descendants were often not classified as black. Census takers and government officials, guided by the Blanqueamiento mindset, would frequently relabel mixed-race individuals as white or mestizo. This statistical manipulation effectively erased the black population from official records. Generation by generation, black identity was diluted on paper. Being identified as white offered social and economic advantages in a society that increasingly privileged European heritage. For many, shedding a visible black identity was a strategy for survival and upward mobility. So, the black population didn't just vanish. They were reclassified out of existence. This historical erasure has had profound and lasting consequences. The myth that there are no black people in Argentina became a cornerstone of the country's national identity. Taught in schools and repeated in daily conversation. It created a society where Afro-Argentines, who are very much still present, are rendered invisible. Today, there is a growing movement of Afro-Argentines who are fighting to reclaim their history and their identity. Activists and community groups are working to challenge the national myth of a purely white nation and demand recognition. They are reviving cultural traditions, conducting their own censuses to prove their existence, and educating the public about the true multicultural history of Argentina. In recent years, the national census has begun to include questions about African ancestry, a small but significant step towards acknowledging the country's hidden diversity. The official 2010 census found around 150,000 people who identified as Afro-descendant, a number that many activists believe is still a significant undercount, but is a start. And how national identity can be constructed by erasing uncomfortable truths. It shows that the absence of a people from a nation's story doesn't mean they were UN there. It often means they were silenced. The whitening of Argentina was not a natural demographic shift. It was a project of erasure. By learning this history, we not only pay respect to the millions of Afro-Argentines whose contributions were buried, but we also gain a more honest and complete understanding of Argentina itself. It's a country not just of European immigrants, but of deep and resilient African roots that are finally, slowly, being brought back into the light. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into a hidden chapter of history. If you found this story as fascinating and important as I do, see you next time!